Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Medical Trauma Support Podcast. I am really excited to talk to Matt Maxwell today. He is a professional life coach, a meditation teacher, and also the author of a book called How to Hold a Cockroach. And there's actually, I think, a longer part to the book title that you can add.
Yes, it's the subtitle is A Book for Those Who Are Free and Don't Know It.
Beautiful. Yes. And I listened to the book and loved it. It was incredibly moving to me. So thank you for writing that and sharing that
Thanks.
out in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So Matt and I were introduced by Kristen, who is the person that I spoke to on our very first podcast. And I believe y'all do some of the meditation work together, supporting.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, if you listen to that episode, she's really focused on. She is a therapist who supports people through individual and group programs around medical trauma. And I've started working with her because mindfulness and meditation are sort of integral parts of people's journey, a lot of them, especially the way that she supports people. And so I've joined her as a meditation, as specifically just supporting people with their meditation practice.
Yeah, that's very cool. So what I would love to start with, Matt, is hearing about your story. You have, like you shared, your own personal experience with medical trauma. And I was hoping that we could start there, if that's good for you.
Yeah, sure. Happy to share. And I'll give sort of a broad picture of some of, all of us have our health history and the ways it's impacted us.
Yeah.
And so my health history started out very great, fine. It seemed like I had a broken collarbone when I fell off a bed. I had a mildish concussion when I fell off a bike. But all in all, very good health history. And one day, a month into my freshman year of high school, I was looking in the mirror and my neck looked real weird. Like one side was skinny and normal, and the other side looked kind of fat, like a football player's. And I went down to my family. I'm like, "Does this look weird to y'all?" They're like, "Yeah, that does look kind of weird." And luckily, we just happened to have sort of a routine doctor's appointment scheduled the next day.
Oh, wow.
Which was really lucky.
Yeah.
And so we're like, well, we'll ask the doctor about it. And a week after that appointment, I was beginning my first round of chemotherapy.
Wow.
And of course, there were a whole series of tests and unknowns in that first week. But I ended up being diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. I was in stage 2 out of 4. So all in all, like a relatively good place to find out.
Yeah.
Good time to find out.
Yeah.
And my freshman year was spent doing chemotherapy, radiation. It was about 9 months of treatment before I was in remission. Lots of experiences in those 9 months.
I can imagine.
And fortunately, a clear plan. I think I've now, as an adult, experienced some health conditions where there's not a clear plan. There's more chronic nature. There's not a lot that's being offered from the medical profession. So now I kind of contrast those experiences. I'm like, that was really awful, and chemo was not fun, and tough experiences in there. And also, I really feel grateful that there was a plan.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I'm also thinking about is the fact that you were a freshman in high school, and my assumption is that you were not able to go to school during that time.
Some of it. At first, of course, everyone's experience with cancer and chemo is going to be unique. And what I imagine is there's been some great developments. I don't know how Hodgkin's is currently treated. So at in the mid 90s, when I was diagnosed, there was a pretty good prognosis. They kind of knew how to treat it. They didn't know how to treat it in a way that was very easy, we'll say.
Right.
But at first everybody's like, oh my gosh. And, luckily, really fortunately, we were really well connected in our community, lots of family friends and parents' work friends and church, supporters. And so there was a lot of community support, which was really nice.
That's amazing. I was actually going to ask about that because that's something huge and scary to go through. And
Yeah.
I was curious how you were supported. What was it
Yeah.
like?
What I experienced though was that at first there was a ton of support. I mean, like our house just had like cookies and meals and flowers and cards, and we had moved from we lived in Colorado when I was diagnosed, but we had moved from Texas just a couple of years before, so also had all this community from there sending all these, like, it was kind of overwhelming. And I did my first round of chemo and was like, I mean, that honestly wasn't that bad. I kind of felt a little off.
Yeah.
Went to school the next day.
Oh, wow.
Not too bad. And I felt kind of embarrassed that I was getting all this attention.
Yeah.
And then over the course of the treatment, the rounds got worse and worse. They were month-long rounds with days in the hospital and,
Yeah.
all kinds of different aspects to them. But as my body broke down from the treatments, by the last couple of months, I was severely sick with a lot less support. People
Right.
kind of got used to that I had cancer and was getting treated. And so those last months were actually, I still had support, but much lonelier. People
Yeah.
weren't reaching out. And like, that's when I needed the love.
Yeah. And I think for anybody listening to this, that's something really good to know is as people are going further into an experience, keep supporting them, stay connected. And I have heard the same thing from people who are in grief from losing a loved one is
Mm-hmm.
that often they're getting a lot of support in the first couple of weeks, and then in 6 weeks they're totally alone. And they, as people who love other people and want to support them, I think remembering that they need support, like ongoing
Yeah.
support.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. And so were you able to go back to school and like engage? It sounds like you went back at the beginning, but as you started to get sicker, I'm assuming that you were then at home and you weren't getting the, kind of distraction and getting to live like the typical life of a ninth grader.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Preparing for this episode, I was kind of reflecting on what are the sort of different categories of traumatic impact that
Yeah.
experience had on me.
Yeah.
And I would say for some people, in like the health arena, um, there's trauma from the actual like sickness or illness or injury
Mm-hmm.
or condition that they've experienced. I didn't really have that.
Mm-hmm.
The worst it got for me, it turns out there was a big, much larger tumor in my chest. Like there were health impacts
Mm-hmm.
from cancer, but they were not noticeable to me.
Mm-hmm.
So in that experience, at least, I didn't experience trauma from the actual health condition. I experienced
Mm-hmm.
it from the treatment.
Yes.
So that's another category, is like sometimes there's really painful, tough impact that we go through in order to ultimately get better.
Right.
And so dealing with whatever came up in the course of our treatment, is it like, and then there's of course like potential trauma from sort of suboptimal medical care
Right.
or
Right.
maybe treatment from medical professionals that was not supportive, right? So like maybe avoidable kinds of trauma that just,
Right.
that's what happened, but maybe didn't have to be part of our treatment.
Right.
So there's that.
Yeah, I think that's really common in people's experiences. There are situations where like mistakes are made, but then there are other situations where the treatment is done correctly, but the people doing the treatment that are engaging with you are maybe in such burnout themselves that they don't have the capacity to give you the connection and the co-regulation that you really need when you're in that really vulnerable state.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, obviously, there's lots of tough stories of ways people have experienced medical care.
Yes.
So there's that category. And then there's like how it affects the rest of your life,
Right.
right? Like in my case, going to school, how much could I go to school? And not just go to school, but participate socially. As I
Yeah.
got sicker and sicker, feeling just lonelier and lonelier,
Hmm.
days or weeks at home,
Yeah.
feeling more and more just sort of like not a reject's not the right word, just life's going by. And that, of course, that age as a freshman in high school, that's
Oh, peer
um,
stuff is so important.
yeah.
It's such a huge part of development at that age.
So there's that kind of, and when I was in school, of course, I lost my hair.
Yeah.
It was like very obvious I was on prednisone, and so my face got real puffy.
Yeah.
I was like, I felt just my appearance was very different than
Yeah.
what would have felt comfortable. Um, so there's those kinds of traumas that aren't, they're just like going about life with your condition or treatment and the way
Yeah.
that changes. And then there's also the, what is this going to mean for my future?
Right.
Just like the fears you have of how is this going to impact me? Of course, in really severe cases, like, am I going to live?
Right.
But even if I have a sense that I'm going to survive, what is my future going to look like? And that's a really scary thing that people have to deal with. So that, at least for me, all of those, most of those really impacted me in tough
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah. And something that's coming up for me that Kristen and I talked about is the grief.
Mm.
The grief that comes along with like you not being able to be there and have those same experiences with your peers and um yeah, the grief of potential loss for what you hope for in the future and yeah, a lot of sadness as you process or sometimes don't process, but
Yeah.
so oftentimes grief really hidden under there, strong grief.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so one thing that I'm curious about is there anybody that stood out in your treatment that was like one of the medical professionals who really did things that felt good and supportive to you?
Yeah. I mean, all in all, I can think of some really inadvertent, um, I would say, like, mistakes
Mhm. Yeah.
in my treatment. Not intended, not mean spirited, just mistakes.
Yeah.
But all in all, I got really lucky because
Yeah.
I was 14 when I was diagnosed. A month later, I actually turned 15 in the hospital
Wow.
um, while I was on IVs, um, and luckily I was in the Children's Hospital here in Colorado, which
Yeah.
was just a very different environment than adult cancer clinics.
Mm-hmm.
In some ways, and in most ways, I would say a much more kind of joyful is a tough word, but there's just sort of like a positivity and a
Yeah.
trying to keep things light and fun. And there was like a Super Nintendo station that they'd wheel into my room so I could play
Mm-hmm.
video games, and I could bring a friend with me while I was
Mm-hmm.
doing chemo so that I could like play games. And
Yeah.
they were much younger. There was sort of this community room of people who were getting treated where we could all kind of hang out if we wanted. Um, and so I think hopefully most oncologists or oncology nurses like wouldn't choose to work in pediatric oncology unless they were willing to bring a generally joyful and sort of positive demeanor. And that was definitely the case at Children's. Like my
Yeah.
primary oncologist was just delightful, warm. Like he would walk around and you'd like hear his laugh down the hallway. Um, so all in all, I would say like I was very fortunate in terms of the caring treatment I received.
Yeah.
There were a few times where I had to get procedures at other hospitals where there were adults around. It was like,
Oh, oh, yes.
so my heart goes out to anybody who's in a hospital situation where there's not a lot of kind of positive vibes trying to be
Right.
spread.
Where you can't hear your doctor's laugh down the hall,
Yeah,
right? Like
yeah,
I can like, yeah, that's really beautiful. Um, yeah, and I think it's important also that even though overall you had that positive experience, that even within that there can still be medical trauma because, like you said, there are
Totally.
so many layers to it.
Yes.
So many layers. And I don't, being a teenager, you may not have felt this as strongly, but now I know there's also the layer for many people of the financial aspect
Yeah.
of going through treatment.
Oh yeah.
That's just another one that,
Yeah, I've experienced that as an adult with my sort of adult conditions.
yes.
As a child, luckily, my parents are awesome and not perfect, but they never talked about the financial impact.
Yeah.
And I think that's in large part because we were just fortunate. My dad had a pretty good job with good health insurance, but
Yeah.
I never heard about it, never,
Yeah.
which is amazing. That really was one thing that, at least in that age, I I tended to take on probably more than I needed to in terms of my
Yeah.
worries and like even caretaking for my family members.
Yeah.
Like part of it was like I don't want them to feel bad, so I don't want to reveal some of the crazy symptoms I'm experiencing because I don't want
Mm-hmm.
them to worry or freak out.
Yeah.
So there were ways in which I would sort of caretake my family members or
Yeah.
community. Um, but yeah, luckily for me, then that was not an added layer of worry.
Yeah.
Um,
Good. I
yeah.
love how you described your parents as being awesome but not perfect, because
Yes.
there's no such thing as a perfect parent. Every parent is going to make mistakes, but I just had to, I love that. I love that a lot. You talked about kind of caretaking and maybe like hiding some of the symptoms so that you didn't upset other people. And
Mhm.
I'm thinking about how you were feeling, like how you were feeling emotionally at that time, and even once you got through the treatments and were in remission, what that was like for you.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I would say at the time, my my like spirituality has dramatically shifted since that time.
Mm-hmm.
But I was raised in a very religious environment, and I would say in a lot of ways that was really helpful for me.
Mm-hmm.
I had this kind of perspective of like God's watching out for me, and God has a plan, and
Mm-hmm.
whether my treatment goes well or not so well, I would say my spirituality was really helpful to me emotionally. There was just kind
Mm-hmm.
of mostly a sense of trust. And it was
Yeah.
like, this might be a really hard thing to get through, but um, there was a background sort of trust in life and
Mm-hmm.
the journey and process I was in.
Yeah.
I don't know if I would have that same perspective now in the same way.
Yeah.
And uh, I don't know necessarily that trust was like well placed, but emotionally it was helpful.
Good. Good. It makes me think of often when we are younger, we have some innocence about the world, and we think things are more, clean and clear cut than we learn that they are as adults. But it
Yeah.
sounds like it was really helpful to have that just like kind of naive trust in what your spiritual beliefs were at that time.
Yeah. Yeah. It did help, honestly. It helped at the time. And I would say, so that helped a little bit emotionally. And that only goes so far
Mm-hmm.
when you're experiencing really like acutely painful experiences. I mean,
Yeah.
it's still nice to have that in the background, but that doesn't make you not feel pain. At least it
Right.
didn't make me not feel pain, you
Right.
know?
Right.
So I would say emotionally, the other things that were present, there was fear.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't just fear of like, am I going to survive all of this? There was just like the day-to-day treatment to treatment fear.
Right.
Certain procedures, some turned out fine. Others
Yeah.
were consistently very uncomfortable.
Mm.
So there was dealing with, especially when you're doing like multiple rounds of something,
Mm-hmm.
you start to know what to expect.
Yeah.
And so you're driving to the hospital knowing about, and they do these rounds, at least for me, they did in a way where it's like treatment, super sick, give it enough time to start to let your body to heal and then dive back in and re-experience,
Mm-hmm.
and each time it was kind of worse, but there was a really clear experience of like, okay, the trauma from prior rounds is totally present for me as I have to drive back to the hospital
Yes.
and go right back into what I've previously felt as really painful.
Did you have any practices, or did your parents have anything that they did on the way?
No.
Yeah.
No, that's maybe something that they've learned more. I would hope is like there's more knowledge and learning in the
Yeah.
last 30 years.
Yeah.
But it was literally like we'd be driving to the hospital and I'd be completely sick, nauseous, like
Yeah.
before starting the next round of chemo.
Right.
My body just like knew it was coming.
Yeah.
And towards the end, like there were times I was kind of joking with my mom, but I was like ready to jump out of the car.
Yes,
Literally just like on the drive, like that route, my body knew the route.
Oh,
right.
Yes.
And even going for checkups years later, when we would drive that route,
Yeah.
I'd be sick again.
That's actually what I was wondering. Like, yeah. Have you driven that route as an adult?
The Children's Hospital is now in a different location. I've been back. I've had family members, young family niece nephews, who've been in Children's, but it's now in a different location. So that helps a little bit to not be quite as triggering. But honestly, even the smell of hospitals for about 20, now I can go back in and I don't get as nauseous.
Yeah.
But I would walk into any hospital and smell this sort of like sterile hospital smell and be totally nauseous. So there's not just like this like emotional trauma. It's like some weird physical level. My whole body still responds to what happened.
You know, I've actually been thinking a lot about this today. In my own healing journey, it has been so intensely physical. You know, I'm like, are there people who just, you know, feel things or like think things, or like, I wonder like how physical is it for other people? So I really viscerally understand what you're saying when you talk about this like very physical component of trauma.
Yeah.
Yeah. The reminders of it. And I think smell it's so common for smell to be able to like pull you right back.
Yes. That's a big part of it. Totally.
Yeah.
Other sights and some sounds but yeah. And then emotionally for me, there was also just, there was the social aspects, the loneliness, the feeling like an outsider. Some friends were good at making me feel included, and a lot of people just felt really awkward. They didn't know how to be with someone, and also times where I just eventually was too sick to go to school, and I was just at home and would still have like visits from people, and that was nice. Anything helps, but I felt so different, and I was very lonely. There were some nights where it's just like, I'm sick, I'm hanging out with my head over the toilet seat, wondering when I'm going to throw up next. My friends are out having fun. It's a Friday evening, you know.
Yeah.
So that loneliness and just that's really hard to be with. And then the fear of the future, like in all of that, there's like what's happening now and how it's scary and hard, and there's also just like, will I recover? And if I do, what are going to be some of the long-term impacts of this?
Right.
You know?
Right. Well, and I know from our previous conversation that you've had a lot of transformation in your life. And so I'm also really curious about when that started. You know, I know sometimes we can experience something and it's like 15 years later that we're in a place where we can start to process it and, you know, release it.
Yeah.
What did that look like for you? Like at the beginning, you know, I want to know kind of the journey, but was there something that really kicked it off like later, or did you start doing some emotional healing pretty close to being done?
Yeah, no. No. You know, and, you know, I've got, I would say, a relatively emotionally intelligent family. Like,
lucky,
aware of emotions, expressive of emotions, and parents who at different times had done their own therapy, but it was a longer time ago, and it was like, oh, good, you're better. oh yeah, good, I'm better. And then like crossing our fingers when we go back for checkups, right? Eventually I was in remission. There was no signs of the cancer, going back every routine visits, and like, okay, whew, still gone. And then me starting to feel better. And luckily the rest of high school, I was healthy and well, and the treatment worked. And it was just kind of like that thing that happened. And my friends, this might sound really awful to people, but I kind of liked it. Friends later in high school would call me Cancer Boy, which might sound really awful, but
it, right?
Yeah, exactly. It actually felt like honor. Yeah. And for me, at least, it felt kind of sweet and honoring the experience I'd been through. So a lot of them knew, like everyone in my high school knew there was this kid that had cancer.
Yeah.
And even like saw me because I was bald, and then they let me wear a hat. And I was like the only kid in high school that could wear a hat. And I wouldn't call myself a celebrity, but some people mostly knew that there was this guy that had cancer. And then a lot of them met me and became friends with me after that. And so there was like an awareness that it had happened. I mean, I have like some actual scars from different procedures. But no, there was just, and it's fine, but like there were underlying traumas and impacts on me emotionally, how I related to myself, how I related to other people, how I related to life, that were just then part of what living meant to me.
Right.
So I would say, and then there was like a follow-up trauma, which is that we had known was a possibility. I didn't know it was basically guaranteed, which was that because of my treatment, I wouldn't be able to have children. And I didn't find that out until my mid-20s when I was married and we were thinking of starting a family. So that was like this big follow-up trauma.
Right.
That was a result of the treatment that had kind of been in the background, but like I just kind of ignored it as a possibility.
Yeah, because you had this other big thing in front of you, which was to survive, right?
Yes. Yeah. So I would say, no, it wasn't until much longer away that I started to become really aware. I mean, and I would say some of those, like the smell sensitivity, some of the, like, I'm driving to the hospital and getting super sick. Some of those things just faded over time. There were foods I could not eat. Because for whatever reason, I craved orange juice that day in the hospital, and I drank a bunch of it while I was on chemo. And for years, I couldn't drink orange juice. It made me sick. Yeah. And that just faded over time. Like there were just very clear. So some things like that just take time.
Right.
And actually, like, we do sort of get better. Like our bodies do forget. We do get that, like, orange juice wasn't the reason I was sick.
Right.
So I would say some things, it just took time.
Yeah.
And probably some tears sometimes.
Oh yeah.
Just letting it out. But I didn't know. I might have cried sometimes feeling something, not knowing how important it was.
Right.
Yeah, I'm glad I did, and I'm glad I could.
Yes. Yes, because you are lucky that you had a family, and things have shifted a lot in 30 years with how open people are with feeling their emotions and naming their emotions and allowing children to have emotions. I think that's a big thing that stops a lot of people up is, as children not being allowed to have those emotions because they dysregulated the adults in charge. Yeah. So I think it's really beautiful that you were able to do that. But so when you were older and you kind of started to step into the transformation, was there an event that kicked it off, or was it just kind of a gradual?
Yeah, I guess so. And I guess I want to speak to one more now. I'm just seeing it now pretty clearly, but another block to me, sort of grieving and feeling what ultimately has been helpful to my healing journey. A block for me that's probably common to a lot of people is that there were people, and I was in the children's hospital with them, with worse scenarios. Children that were sicker than I was. I mean, part of the hard thing about being in the children's hospital is that not everyone that I was being treated with survived. Right. Right. And so in a way it was nice. It was a nice perspective shifter for me to be like, okay, this is not fun.
Mm-hmm.
And this 6-year-old's been on chemo for 2.5 years.
Right.
And I'm really grateful that I'm not experiencing that. Right. So sometimes it's nice to just get that like dose of perspective, but also it can make you stifle your feelings because they don't feel like justified or worthy. Well, it's not as bad as them. I shouldn't feel bad or something, or I should just feel grateful that I'm in this case and not that case. And so I see that like part of what limited me from actually really feeling and then caring for the parts of me that had suffered was that story of like my suffering shouldn't be so bad, or I shouldn't feel so much or something.
Right.
And luckily I've really let that go, but I think I couldn't really love and care for the parts of me that experienced really deep trauma until I let go of that story.
Yeah.
Yes, we all have different stories, and some people have really tough things. That does not mean that what I've gone through is not suffering.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, honestly, what triggered a lot of my journey off was like a completely different trigger, which was this breakup that was just really, really hard for me.
Yeah, it was a loss.
In ways that I hadn't expected, and like was really surprisingly traumatizing.
Yeah.
But what happened in the space of that, as I was like so hurt and so lost and so whatever, and maybe I was safe enough. I don't know. It's like all of my trauma came out in that experience.
Yeah.
I started doing this bit of inner child work, and like listening to my inner child and letting that part of me express their feelings, which was mostly just like sobs and tears.
Yeah.
And caring for that part. And as I started that process in relationship to my breakup and this sort of abandonment that I felt, like all these other places of hurt that I just kind of stuffed down, started to become apparent. Like, oh,
they're like, oh, he's listening.
There's all these places going back to when I was really little, definitely including my experience with cancer, where there had been hurt and pain, and just it was still there.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't till my mid-30s when I started to be like, oh, wow.
Yeah.
And wow is not a strong enough word for it.
Oh my gosh. I've seen this meme that talks about the healing, and it's like what you think it is, and it's like the wind blowing through your hair. And then really what it is somebody like holding on for dear life and screaming.
Yeah.
I feel like words can't express that. Only a picture that just shows the absolute terror and overwhelm of processing these old things. And like when you were describing that, I just kind of imagined all these like younger versions of you just, oh, okay, he's going to see us now. And you just have like this line and they're all waiting.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a pretty good way to put it.
Yeah.
And what got practiced in that there was sort of like these dual roles that I was practicing. And I want to say like, I'm going to speak to some of my like really useful therapeutic processes, and that I'm not a licensed counselor. I can only speak to what I've experienced and how amazingly transformational it was.
Yes.
But I am not equipped or qualified to tell someone they should do these kinds of practices. This is just what's worked for me.
I'm glad that you shared that, because I think, it's important for people to understand that there are so many different ways to heal or transform or feel better, whatever you want to call it. They don't work for everybody. There's no one thing other than self-compassion. I think self-compassion and support are kind of the two things we all need in it. Like we need support from other human beings. We just do.
Yeah.
And from, animals too. If whoever's listening is having a hard time finding support from humans, animals can also be a really good place.
Yeah, safe place. Yeah.
But I would love to hear some of the things that were helpful for you.
Yeah, I think so. And I would say definitely amen to like support and self-compassion is a big part of what I'm about to share. But like I did eventually get a really great therapist. and a lot of other sources of support.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think, yeah, a lot of other sources of support were parts of this. My meditation practice became really, really integral to being able to continue with the kind of healing work that I was doing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's part of the reason I'm such an advocate for meditation,
Yeah.
and love sharing it with people.
Can I ask you something about that, Matt?
Yeah.
So, what I hear is that you were using meditation as a way to kind of be with the other things that were happening. And meditation allowed you to be with them in a different way. Is that what you were saying, or am I
Yeah.
misunderstanding that?
I mean, honestly, I went through a phase where I was so miserable.
Mm-hmm.
And I had been like, we haven't talked about my career, but eventually I went on to law school at the University of Chicago. I was practicing law at a very high level.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of things about my life were working. I had
Mm-hmm.
this big religious transition that's totally a different topic. But in the aftermath of this breakup, I was like just totally messed up.
Yeah.
I I was devastated. I was depressed. Like I didn't. It wasn't that serious of a relationship, so it was kind of confusing to me why I felt so devastated.
Yeah.
It's just like all of the grief of my life suddenly showed up in the context of this breakup,
Yeah.
and I was
You're
so
cracked
miserable. Like
open.
every day was like I don't know. I wouldn't say I was suicidal because I've had family members commit suicide, and I will not do that.
Yeah.
But every day was like, why would I keep living?
Right.
Like, how am I going to do today? And why, like, I was in the dark, really in a dark
Yeah.
place. And that was obviously not fun, but I was so broken in a way that I was open to anything that
Right.
would help.
Yeah.
Anything.
Yeah.
So I read all these books about everything, and somebody's like, you should try meditation. I'm like, great. What is that? And I read this book and I read that book, and I finally started doing real therapy. And like, I was just open,
Yeah.
in a way. So I didn't have a reason I started meditating other than people are like, this is a good thing to do that helps you feel a little better. And I'm like,
Yeah.
great, I'll take that.
Did you feel the impact of meditation quickly, or did it take a while for you to
Yeah,
really
I
start to feel
did.
better?
Yeah. I'll just mention the book that I read that ended up being part of my like medical trauma recovery, but I read it in the context of this breakup recovery I was in.
Mm-hmm.
The book's called The Journey from Abandonment to Healing.
I'll share that
So
in
good, by
the
Susan Anderson.
notes.
It may not hit everybody, but right where I was in my life at that moment, like it was really medicine for my soul. I needed it. And one of the first things that she has you practice when you're in this really dark space of abandonment, is not, she doesn't call it meditation. I mean, it's just like getting very, very mindful and connected with your senses.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not, meditation is not intended to be an escape
Mm-hmm.
from what's so for us,
Mm-hmm.
but really paying attention to something in our senses, whether it's an internal body sensation or something external, a sound or a sight, like really, really, really getting present with something
Mm-hmm.
is a pretty safe space to be.
Mm-hmm.
It can give us access to some sense of safety sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
that can help us actually to feel things that otherwise might be too scary.
Absolutely. I really do think that the first step to healing from trauma is safety.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's a minuscule piece of safety, because I do think it grows,
Mm-hmm.
it builds on itself. But without safety, it's hard to be able to connect, which I
Yes.
think is so important. It's.
Yes, totally. So it's like, even if everything seems awful, and maybe in some ways is awful, put that in quotes, but it's like, I can take this sip of water and like really taste it, really
Mm-hmm.
experience what it's like to have it like go down my throat and then to swallow. And even in like that tiniest moment of mindfulness and just like really paying attention to the water,
Mm-hmm.
there's just like a tiny sense of okayness in that, or
Mm-hmm.
of safety, So, so yes, practicing mindfulness did start to make it sort of safer for me to actually feel some of the
Mm-hmm.
stuff that I needed to feel
Mm.
in order to love and guide those parts of me that had suffered out of the suffering.
Yeah. Yeah. And to, I think sometimes we don't want to feel the things. There's a reason we pushed them away,
Yeah.
right? But it is, I think, a really crucial part of healing is to finally meet those places.
Yeah.
And there are different ways we can meet them and different ways to support ourselves as we do it. But I don't know that I've met anyone that has had their healing process that hasn't had to sit and meet and be with
Yeah.
those.
Yeah.
I think
Yep. I mean, again, I'm not a therapist. Like, this is not my area of expertise. There's just what I've experienced and sort of what I believe. But we don't get to a place of really feeling our wholeness
yeah,
and okayness around the feelings.
yeah, right,
We
right.
get there through the feelings.
I also want to. I know you're not a therapist, but I also think that lived experience is really important, and I
Yeah.
think that you are the expert on your lived experience and the expert on healing from trauma, and
Mhm.
so I'm really thankful that you're sharing it.
Thanks. Yeah. So I'll just name like a few practices that were really transformational. I mean, when I say that, I mean like night and day difference in how I experienced myself and how I experienced life.
Yeah.
Um, One is that in the space of this breakup and doing this sort of like inner child work,
Hmm.
I practiced allowing
Hmm.
two parts of myself that have become a really great team.
Hmm.
And one of those parts is the parts of me, particularly younger parts,
Hmm.
that have really had a hard time,
Yeah. Yeah.
that were really there and experiencing the pain or the trauma or the emotional suffering,
Hmm.
you know?
Hmm.
Um, they're awesome. They're not, I'm so grateful for them.
Hmm.
They're not parts of me that I wish to suppress.
Right. Yeah.
So I was practicing releasing the judgment
Yeah.
and letting those parts just
Yeah.
be. Let it be scary. Let it be hard. Let it be devastating.
Mm.
Let it be terrifying. Like,
Hmm.
not rejecting or suppressing or judging that I have those emotions about my experience, some of my experiences,
Hmm.
you know?
I have this like really beautiful visual of you now, like just holding that younger version of you, just like I think like a loving parent would do for a
Yes.
child that is hurting, just hold them and rock them. And
Yes.
yeah, that inner child work has been a huge part of my own healing as well. And there have
Yeah.
been times that I've been sitting in my little meditation spot, literally
Yes.
rocking that little younger person, younger version of me that was hurt
Exactly.
and
Exactly.
didn't get that from anyone else, didn't get what it needed at that time or what
Yeah.
she needed at that time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And for some of us, luckily, I was in such a rough place that like I said, I was kind of like open to anything.
yeah.
Some of us were conditioned from such an early age that we shouldn't be crybabies.
Hmm.
Like that conditioning started so early for some of us
Hmm.
that making the leap to holding the emotional parts of ourselves
Right.
where there are tears and devastation and tantrums,
Yeah.
holding them with just like love and acceptance is
Yeah.
really contrary to our early conditioning. So that's a
Absolutely.
practice. Like, it took a while,
Yeah.
but that's what you're in. So there's like dual parts, right? You're both allowing and accepting and sort of being. I'm going to put this in major quotes: the crybaby,
Yeah.
right? The parts of you that suffered, that were stifled, that experienced whatever they experienced and had an awful time of it. You know,
Yeah.
you're allowing that, and you're also strengthening and allowing the parts of you that are extraordinarily compassionate and loving and can embrace any of that emotion.
Right. Right.
With love and acceptance and care.
Yes.
So I was like strengthening these muscles of like allowing and loving him.
Yes.
Accepting him, not needing him to change. That wasn't like, okay, now, okay, that's enough.
Right.
Okay, no more. No, it's I love you no matter how much you cry.
Yes.
No matter how much you feel, no matter how upset you are, nothing could stop me from loving you. Nothing. And so like engaging that, like every day I'd engage in this sort of like conversation between this really loving, compassionate sort of adult, Matt, and this young child that had suffered all these things.
Yeah.
So that was like the big picture process. And of course, in the process of like allowing those emotions, all kinds of different experiences come up. But that child was along the ride for early childhood stuff, elementary school, cancer, stuff as an adult, emotional, like relationship breakups, trauma. So more specifically, as I learn and then what you find is that if you accept it and love it and allow it enough, you start to be free. That little child is like, oh, I'm loved. It's okay. And like the trick is you can't force this. You got to love those parts wherever they are.
Yeah,
and
there's
just
no
love them there.
timeline. It's not like you just have to do this for
a week, 7 days, and all better. Right. No, it doesn't work like that. Right. Especially for those of us who spent years not listening.
Yes,
that stuff's in our body.
Yeah,
there'd be times where I'm like, and as you gain this sort of meditation helps in another way, I think, in that you can really be feeling feelings.
Yeah,
I mean, body shaking, convulsing, sobbing, like snot, just like sort of unbelievable amounts of snot keep pouring out. It's like, where is this coming from? And you can still be present with yourself. So you're not like lost in that emotion. You're not lost in the grief. You're feeling the grief and you're holding yourself in it.
Yes. And it's not only the grief too. I mean, all the big emotions, even, I mean, I had a recent one where I was watching this behavior that I thought, gosh, this is like a tween or a teenager kind of like feelings coming up for me. It felt super strong. And even in that, there was this part of me that's kind of watching like, oh, okay, all right. Wow, you're really angry. Okay.
Yeah, the anger too. Exactly. Yes. And we can be so conditioned that anger is not acceptable in the same way that we can be conditioned sadness isn't.
Well, and it's interesting too, because when you were talking about that, I thought a lot about, some of the common things in our society for little boys and the expectation that boys don't cry, but then some of the expectations for girls, like it's not okay to get angry. No, you don't get angry. So I think there's even some like gender stuff that comes into these different messages that can be different.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And I mean, and that, I mean, a very common experience for people in all kinds of different medical care is, and especially for younger people, at least with adults, there might be some sense of I'm choosing this treatment. And they're about to do things to my body that I do not want them to do.
Right.
And I have a choice about this.
Right.
A lot of young people are not given a choice or don't feel that they have one.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I do think about the whole thing that got me into this area was one of my children who started to have procedures at 2 weeks old.
Wow.
A 2-week-old baby does not have a choice if the parent is bringing them. And then I'm not going to go into this here, but just kind of some of what can happen with the child feeling like they aren't protected by their parent. I'll have to talk about that another time.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Great point. But what's natural, now looking back, I'm like, I experienced one particular extremely painful moment where they messed up the anesthetic and I basically didn't have any. And I was lying on my stomach and I had a bone marrow extraction. Now when I think about that, I'm like, that is as painful and invasive a thing as someone can do to your body.
Yes.
Pretty close. Maybe there's
Yeah.
worse, but it's up there.
Yeah.
And the natural body response to that is to beat the shit out of somebody.
Exactly. Yes. You're gonna
Is to
fight.
fight back.
Yes.
And we're either conditioned or just choosing not to do that. But like, that's in our body still too.
Oh,
Right.
that energy. If that doesn't get released, that energy hangs out. That just gets stuck.
Yeah. And we're ready. And of course, there's lots of, we could go into like, what is the impact of the ways in which we hold on to all of this? How does it impact our relationships? How does it experience how we experience ourselves and life and any other thing we ever do? It's like, right, we're still in reaction to some of these experiences.
A question I have for you about your experience with that is, as you were releasing things and, doing some of the shaking, I do think that is actually discharging held things in our bodies. But then you have this body, at least in my experience, it almost feels like a new body. And you're like, oh, this, I'm curious if you feel that, like if you felt that and what was that like for you?
Yeah. So one way I look at it is that at least some of that trauma or the emotional pain that's sort of suppressed um, is related to stories. So there's just purely what happened, and there's trauma from what happened. I experienced this painful thing, and now when I see anything like that, I'm like, right. But that's a story, because a lot of what we're experiencing is like, that would happen to me again. Or it's like, how do I say this? If someone gets food poisoning, this is maybe a simple example. Someone gets food poisoning at an Italian restaurant. Are they going back to that restaurant anytime soon? Probably not.
Yeah.
They're definitely not going to get the same dish.
Yeah.
But when you have that experience, there's like layers of meaning that might automatically be made. Right? So one is like, that dish at that Italian restaurant isn't safe.
Right.
Which may not be true.
But it's probably, I would guess it's not true often because the restaurant would be shut down.
There's some mistake. Yeah, there's some mistake that was made, or it wasn't even that thing that did it, but our mind just thinks it was. But even if it was that thing, even if it was exactly that meal that did it, okay, does that mean the next? No, but people will be like, I'm not going to eat that dish again. Okay, it makes sense. People will be like, I'm not going to go back to that restaurant again. Might make sense. Even if it was a 1 in a million occurrence. People might be like, I'm never eating Italian food again. People might be like, I'm never eating food again. Which is what some of us have done in some areas of our life. We've actually created a story that's hurting us more than the experience did.
Right.
Or something. And that's natural. It just happens.
Yeah.
We'll create other stories like, it's not safe to be alive. Or it's not, life doesn't love me. Or something like that, right? These really broad layers of meaning get attached to these traumas. And so for me, part of the work was like honoring and loving that I experienced things that were really painful, and allowing that emotion to come out and letting him feel all the feelings. And then noticing some of these stories, like, I am alone and no one cares. That is not the truth, but it got tied to those events.
Right.
And so part of my journey is like, I love you. Whatever you feel is okay. And I want to help you see some of this differently.
Yes. Yeah. Changing.
But like, if you'd like to, right? This is like a loving, but post emotion, and with like that loving, accepting internal environment.
Yeah.
I can actually help him see things differently.
Right. And it also makes me think about, supporting parents as they're supporting their kids through a medical experience. I think all the things we've talked about, the ways that you've shared that the grown-up loving Matt was showing up for like the younger versions of you, that's the same way a parent can show up for their child now. In that same way. So, if somebody's listening and their child is about to have a procedure or had one or is going through cancer treatment, to know that you can just hold them and let them cry until they are done for that, day.
Yeah.
And but to not try to stop it, to not try to say, oh, okay, you're okay. Because really that's about the parent's discomfort, not the child's. It is okay to cry. It is okay to let
Yeah.
it.
And look, parent, I mean, I don't know what it's like to be a parent. Holy crap. That seems, I still kind of want to be one somehow, but this is, I give advice to parents very hesitantly. I don't know what it's like. And if someone's experiencing the sort of need to like at all stifle like a child's emotions, they're probably stifling their own.
Absolutely.
And that's
Absolutely.
going to be like, just like I was like caretaking,
Yeah.
right? Parents can be in like, I need to be the stoic, responsible one and not realize how much terror they're experiencing.
They are absolutely going to experience terror. And I will tell you that as a parent whose child has been through procedures, and
Yes.
one of my children a couple years ago was put under for a procedure, and I had to do a lot of my own processing. And that also included processing some of the stuff that had happened with my older child when they were a baby that I
Yeah.
had tucked away.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
that we should talk
Yeah.
about that.
So all these give us chances to recover. But also, let me just say this really specifically. Part of that loving inner child adult process eventually became going in my mind and being with him when he was laying on his belly about to experience that procedure and
Yes.
experiencing it and literally like holding the teenager
Yeah.
and saying, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry you're experiencing this.
Yes.
I love you so much.
Yeah.
You are not alone. I'm
Yeah.
right here with you. Because even these experiences where people in the room, you feel alone.
Yes.
So I've gone to him when I'm actually in my parents' home right now, which is kind of crazy. This is actually the room I was in when I had chemo and was
Wow,
sick.
Matt.
Yeah. And this bathroom right here is where I would throw up and be sitting there. Right. So
Wow.
I've actually I've like gone to him sitting there next to the toilet and been like, I love you.
Yeah.
Nothing's wrong. It's all okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing this. Right. Like,
Yeah.
so, and this is all like 20 plus 25, 30 years later, going
Yeah.
back and just really loving him through these experiences. And that does actually change the way that they now occur to me.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. That is so beautiful. That is so beautiful. I would love to just talk to you every day. I mean, and just like, I want to know so much more. I wish that we could just keep talking about it, but I feel so incredibly grateful that you've shared this. And especially like sitting in the same room that younger version of you was in when they went through this hard experience. So I just thank you.
Yeah.
Matt, I didn't know if there's anything that you wanted to share. I know that you're a professional life coach and you are an author and you're a meditation teacher. And I don't know if you have any offerings coming up that could be supportive to people that are in their own process right now. And if so, if you
Yeah.
could share
Yeah.
that.
Thanks for that opportunity. I'll share that. And then before we wrap, there's one more thing I want to share.
Okay.
But yeah, let's see. If some of what we talked about today struck a chord, I think a listener would enjoy listening to my book or reading my book.
I agree.
It's sort of like a children's book for adults. It's illustrated, but it speaks to like sort of allowing and getting curious about the ways in which we're suffering and how to tend to those from a place of curiosity. So my book's a nice place to start, probably. I do sort of life and leadership coaching, and some of this comes into that, though some of where we were is more of a sort of emotional healing realm. So I would say like I don't personally offer that at the moment.
But you do bring
But
that lived
if what I
experience.
speak to resonates, like my coaching does come from a place of bringing a ton of compassion for ourselves, and kind of creating our lives from a place of acceptance and love and care. So coaching is available. I'd be happy to talk to someone if they think that's of interest. And coaching, I would say, just for people who aren't aware, the way that I think of coaching versus therapy is that coaching's mostly future oriented. It's around our goals, where we're trying to get to, whether it's in our career or relationships or health or whatever. But that's the focus of my coaching. And then I also do meditation instruction, and actually guiding people through how to practice meditation, doing guided sessions together. There's lots of different ways to practice. So, and they can go to my website, howtoholdacockroach.com, or thisishearthstone.com.
I'll put that in the notes so people can look into the notes and they can find that information.
Great. That'd be awesome. Thank you. Okay, can I leave people with one more thing before we wrap? I know we've gone way over time, and maybe we'll split it up or cut it or whatever. I think that the last thing I want to share, especially if someone's in a medical situation that's scary or unpredictable, or maybe even post. But when I finished and was in remission, I did chemo and then I did radiation. I told my parents, and I meant it, if I get cancer again, I'm going to die. I'm not going to do that again. Because my perspective was like that it wasn't worth going through. It was so hard. And I now have 28 amazing years of life, and highs and lows and love and challenge and adventure. And like, you don't know what good will come from what you're going through. And sometimes things don't go well and we don't make it. But I'll just say, if you're in a place where you're inclined to discontinue or that it's not worth it, we just don't know what amazing things might come from the choice to lean in when treatments seem really awful or painful or scary. And that goes to parents too. I'm so grateful for my parents for the ways they supported my treatment. So I come back to that now with some of my adult health challenges. When things seem dark or hopeless, we don't know what might be coming, and that's a gift. So I guess an encouragement to hang in there if you're in the dark right now.
Thank you so much. That's beautiful, Matt. And I'm so thankful for you sharing your time and your lived experience and your journey, your transformative journey.
Thank you. Thanks for listening and for being such a support for people like me. And there are a lot of us. So appreciate you so much.
Yes. Thank you.